In August of 2021, the world was just glued to their screens, watching in absolute shock as the Afghan government and its military, something built over 2 decades with trillions of dollars, just completely vaporized in a matter of days. The fall of Kabul, it wasn't just another battle lost. It was the stunning final chapter of America's longest war.
So that brings us to the big, haunting question that hangs over all of this. How did it all go so wrong? How could an investment of that scale by the most powerful military in the world just end in total collapse? Well, let's get into it.
You know, when you start looking for answers, you don't find one single bad decision or one wrong turn. The sources are really clear on this. The failure was systemic. It was woven into the very DNA of the American approach from the beginning. So let's break down the 4 core pillars of this strategic failure.
First up, what we can call the doctrine trap. See, the U.S. military showed up with a playbook, a grand theory for how you're supposed to win this kind of war. The problem? It was the wrong playbook for a completely different war.
This playbook was called counterinsurgency, or COIN for short. And look, in theory, it's a pretty sophisticated idea. You're not just there to fight the bad guys. You're trying to win the hearts and minds of the people. You build schools, you dig wells, you provide security. The goal is to make the government seem like a better choice than the insurgency, and you basically starve the enemy of local support. Sounds good, right?
But here's the thing. This strategy wasn't tailor-made for Afghanistan at all. It was imported, largely because of the success, or at least the perceived success, of the military surge in Iraq. U.S. military leaders got so confident that they'd found this universal key, a kind of one-size-fits-all solution for any modern conflict.
And this right here really illustrates the problem perfectly. Iraq and Afghanistan were just fundamentally different places. In Iraq, the success everyone talked about, it hinged on making a political deal with Sunni tribes in a war that was mostly urban. But then you look at Afghanistan. It's a deeply rural, tribal society. The insurgents had a totally untouchable safe haven right across the border in Pakistan. And the whole idea of a strong, centralized government was completely alien to centuries of local tradition. The blueprint just didn't fit the landscape.
So what happened was, COIN stopped being just a strategy. It became dogma. It was an article of faith. It was applied with this belief that if you just threw enough money and enough troops at the problem, you could bend reality to your will, ignoring all the deep cultural and political facts on the ground that really doomed it from the start.
Now, that flawed doctrine was made so much worse by a second, equally destructive problem. A personnel system that seemed almost perfectly engineered to erase knowledge and institutionalize amnesia.
This number, this says it all. Less than 1 year. That was the typical tour of duty for most U.S. personnel. I mean, think about that. By the time someone even began to figure out the local politics, the tribal dynamics, who the real players were, they were already packing their bags to go home.
And this quote from the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction is just devastatingly accurate. He called it an annual lobotomy. All that critical knowledge about who the village elders were, what projects worked, what didn't, it wasn't passed on. It just vanished. It walked out the door every single year.
And you can just picture this totally self-defeating cycle, right? A new unit arrives, completely green, knowing nothing. They spend the first half of their tour just getting their bearings. Then, for maybe a few short months, they're actually effective. But almost as soon as they get good at their jobs, they're focused on leaving. And then their replacements show up and start all over again at square one, making the exact same mistakes. It was institutional amnesia, on a loop, for 20 years.
So this short-term thinking led directly to the third major failure. With these tours lasting less than a year, commanders were under enormous pressure to show progress and to show it fast. And this created what you could call a tyranny of metrics, where what was easy to count became way more important than what actually mattered.
This slide just shows the fundamental disconnect perfectly. The entire war effort became obsessed with measures of performance, basically inputs. Things like how much money was spent, how many schools were built, how many patrols were conducted. What got lost in all that were the measures of effectiveness, the actual outcomes. Was the government seen as legitimate? Was there real, lasting stability? Was there trust? Those were the questions that really mattered, but they were almost never the focus.
In this quote from a senior aid official, it just says everything. The pressure coming from Washington, from Congress, it was all about activity, not impact. The primary question was, did you spend the money we gave you, not did that money actually do any good? So spending money became the goal in itself, whether or not that spending was building a country that could actually stand on its own.
And the result of that kind of thinking is laid bare right here in this chart. I mean, just look at the trend of enemy-initiated attacks. Despite massive surges in troops and spending, especially after 2009, the violence didn't go down, it went up. All of the inputs, the money, the projects, the patrols, had zero positive correlation with the one outcome that mattered most: security. We were busy, but we weren't winning.
And that leads us directly to the fourth major failure. An aid strategy that looked fantastic on a PowerPoint slide but was completely self-defeating in the real world.
So, on the surface, the plan seemed perfectly logical. The U.S. knew that rampant corruption in the Afghan government was basically fuel for the insurgency, so they decided to use aid money as leverage. The message was supposed to be simple: clean up your act, or we turn off the financial spigot.
But this created a massive fundamental paradox. The entire U.S. strategy, everything they were doing, was staked on the survival and the success of the government in Kabul. They were our partner. So what happens if you actually follow through on your threat to cut them off?
Well, exactly. Cutting off the money would have caused the Afghan government to immediately collapse, which would mean the entire U.S. strategy had failed. It was completely self-defeating. And of course, the Afghan officials knew this perfectly well. They basically called America's bluff time and time again, knowing that the aid was just too critical to ever be truly withheld. The leverage was a total illusion.
So when you put all these pieces together, you don't see a single point of failure. You see a series of interconnected systemic flaws that created a collapse that, looking back, was just tragically predictable.
So to sum it all up, the anatomy of failure really had these four parts. First, a misapplied doctrine that just ignored the reality on the ground. Then, a personnel system that guaranteed we'd forget everything we learned. Add to that a focus on shallow metrics instead of real progress. And finally, an aid strategy that gave us no real leverage. Together, they created a house of cards that was just destined to fall.
And look, this isn't just me saying this in hindsight. Douglas Lute, a three-star general who coordinated Afghanistan strategy at the White House for 2 different presidents, he put it as bluntly as possible: we were devoid of a fundamental understanding of Afghanistan. We didn't know what we were doing. That is just a shocking admission, coming from the very highest levels of power.
And that right there is the real tragedy of this whole story. You see images like this one, and you see the genuine efforts, the real relationships that were built on the ground by countless dedicated individuals. But all of their sacrifice, all of their hard work, it was all happening inside a much, much larger strategic framework that was fundamentally broken from day one. Which leaves us with the most important question of all. The lessons from this 20-year failure are incredibly stark, and they're incredibly painful, but will they be remembered? The ultimate test is whether, for the next crisis, the United States has finally learned to ask these critical questions before a war begins, instead of in the post-mortems written decades later.